Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, and in this video I want to talk about how to read code and why you might want to read code, why it's important to read code and get better at reading code as a developer. The reason I wanted to do this video, even though several other people have done videos more or less on this topic, is that I don't think anyone's quite hit the nail on the head. There was a video by Tim Corey, I'll leave a link to that down in the description, where he talked more about the why and less about the how. I really want to get into the how, though I will touch on the why just in case you've never seen any videos like that or you're still wondering why it is important to read code. So without further ado, the first reason you might want to read code and this is aside from the often cited statistic, I don't know where it came from, but it's been said that developers spend more than half of their time reading code. That might be true. The comparison is reading code versus writing code. Basically that we spend a lot more time reading code, either our own or someone else's, than we spend writing code. I don't know if that's true, but we definitely spend a whole lot of time reading code, and here are some of the reasons that we spend reading code. Number one is we might read code to get better. We might read code to see examples of how to do a particular thing using the programming languages that we're using and using the platforms that we're using. Either tutorials or Stack Overflow answers, which I'll talk more about in a second. It's not uncommon to want to read code and see examples of how to do the thing that we're trying to do. The next reason we might read code is to troubleshoot or fix a bug either in our own code or in someone else's code. Basically, in order to fix a bug, you need to step through each line in code and figure out what's going on, what the computer is doing, and that's reading code. In a nutshell, that's reading code. So it's really important to be able to read code and get better at reading code in order to troubleshoot and fix bugs, and not just in other people's code. You're never going to remember every single line of code you've ever written. So even if you only wrote a piece of code yesterday, for instance, the fact that there's a bug in there means that you didn't, fully grasp everything that needed to go into that piece of code. So it really helps to kind of take a step back and actually take a step in, dive even deeper, and go through the code line by line to figure out, what it is you missed. And this is not a dig on anyone. I write bugs too, all the time. Not intentionally, obviously, but we all write code. We're all going to write bugs. It's okay. But being able to read code and read our own code even as if it's code that someone else wrote is really going to help us get that much better at debugging and troubleshooting code. Next up, we might want to read code because we want to understand a new code base. So the use case for this is something like you're starting a new job. The likelihood that you're starting on a brand new project at that job is very, very small. You're likely joining a team that's been working on this code for a long time, so they understand it really well. They understand it implicitly. They almost don't need to write comments. They understand it so well. But that's not the case for you. You're brand new to this project, and being able to read code and understand code that someone else has written is going to help you understand what's going on in the code and be able to hit the ground running that much faster. Next up, we want to be able to read code because in a lot of cases we have things like Stack Overflow, and we'll actually see some Stack Overflow questions and answers toward the end of the video. I actually pull up some Stack Overflow questions and answers that I was looking for last week or the week before. They're good examples. They have some code in there, but the important part is that the code is not going to translate exactly into where I needed to use it. It's not something where I'm going to be able to copy and paste. But I am going to need to understand the concepts. I'm going to need to understand why people wrote the code that they did in the answers and what it's doing, and be able to apply it to the code that I've written. Even if I start out with copying and pasting, I'll at least need to change some variable names or something along those lines. So being able to read code really helps me out in those respects. And that kind of leads into the next one I have on my list, which is reading code is not about copying and pasting, right? We're not saying, oh, you can see code, you can see that it's valid, and let's just copy and paste it. You will have to need to change variable names and that sort of thing. Maybe even some function calls. You might need to adapt the code a little bit. And being able to read the code, even if you do start out with copying and pasting, means that you have that starting point, and you understand the code at a deeper level, so you can make those changes and get where you need to go. Even if you start with copying and pasting. Now, some prerequisites to being able to read code. And these are very important. It should not be glossed over. We can't just dive in to reading code and say, oh, these things don't matter. First up is the syntax of the programming languages that you're using, or the specific programming language that you're using. For instance, things like what a for loop looks like and what an if-else statement looks like, how you call functions. And I'm talking super simple stuff, like as simple as, does the language use parentheses to call functions, or do you not use parentheses? Are semicolons required? Does the plus operator do addition? Stuff that we would normally consider kind of stupid, but those fundamental pieces of the programming language are important building blocks. They need to be kind of muscle memory. They need to be things that we don't even think about anymore. Luckily, it doesn't take that long to pick those up from a programming language. Most programming languages have like a cheat sheet. Not even a cheat sheet. We're talking note card for these sorts of things. So that's something that you can easily pick up. You don't have to, go through tutorial upon tutorial just to pick those things up. I'm talking about the very basic stuff. Just like the simplest syntax of the language. The next prerequisite is a little bit more complicated, but if we've done even just one application using our programming language, we've probably seen this before. And what I'm calling this is kind of the semantics of the tech stack. So what I mean by this is, like, if you're dealing with a Node.js app that's using Express, vaguely understand what an Express app looks like. App.get, app.put. I'm assuming that's what Express still looks like. The last time I used Express, that's what it looked like. So I probably need a refresher on that if I were going to be debugging some Express stuff. In C#, LANT, ASP.NET, MVC, that's where I've spent a lot of my time recently. Understanding things like startup.cs, that, what goes in there, not in depth, like what functions you need to be calling, but the purpose of that file and that sort of thing. That's what I'm talking about. Kind of if you think about the syntax as the very lowest level pieces, the semantics I'm talking about are the very highest level pieces, like just kind of generally where things are going to go. Controller classes, what they're used for and how they would be invoked from a simple web request. Nothing complicated. I'm not, I'm trying to go super simple here, but there are some kind of simple building blocks that you will need to understand in order to be able to successfully read code. And those are things that hopefully should just fade into the background. They're more things that kind of assist your understanding than, you shouldn't stress out about them. If you feel like you don't have all of those things memorized, it's probably not the end of the world, but you might come across more things as you're reading code that you're a little bit more confused on, that you might need to look up a little bit more. So with that said, let's talk about the actual process of reading code. So the first thing that I look for is inputs and outputs. If the code example that you're looking at is a function, that's very easy. You can look at the function signature, the parameters are the inputs, the return type is the output, essentially the output. You also look for a return statement somewhere in the function body, and that gives you the value that gets returned. So that's important to kind of establish some, kind of structure, some context for where the code that you're looking at fits in. If you're not looking at a function, either go deeper and look at a function. If you're looking at a class or something like that, it might be easier to start at the function level, or potentially even narrower scope. If you're looking at a really large function, look at a really narrow scope and look at the inputs and outputs to that block. A for loop, for instance, you have the iteration variable or the collection that you're iterating over. That's kind of your input, and whatever you're doing to it is your output. The next step after that, and in some cases the lines might kind of be blurred on this, is some assumptions that are being made. And a lot of cases in Stack Overflow answers, there are going to be a lot more assumptions that you need to be on the lookout for than you might find in the inputs and outputs territory, because typically Stack Overflow answers aren't written as full functions. In one of the ones that we're going to look at, I'm actually looking at the screen right now. So let me switch over to that screen. Let's try. There we go. Okay, so this Stack Overflow question that I'm looking at right here, there is an assumption that there's a variable called sumLength. And here, I don't think it really needs to be described. I'll go through exactly what this question is asking in just a minute. But I don't really think that the variable sumLength needs to be described because it's kind of self-descriptive. It's sumLength. So hopefully people are using their variable names to be a little more descriptive so they don't have to add, in the case of a Stack Overflow answer, a lot more information to explain what the variable represents, or if you're in actual code, hopefully it aids readability because the variable is named something reasonable. But that's still an assumption, right? SumLength is not a variable that's declared anywhere in this piece of code. SumLength comes from somewhere else. So there's obviously an assumption that there's a variable present called SumLength, a variable in scope called SumLength. Now next is basically stepping through each line, or more accurately each statement or piece of a statement, and understanding what is actually being accomplished on that particular line. So in this case, we can take this piece out and say, okay, so we assume we have sumLength. And actually, before I go any further, let me explain what this question is asking. So I was trying to create an array of empty strings. This is not my question. This is a question that I came across while I was looking for the answer. Basically, they're looking for creating an empty array. And the goal is to have the array contain some value. In this case, an empty string is what they want to start out with. So first up, their example, this is in the question, is calling the array constructor and passing in sumLength. So this is basically if they wanted to create an array of 10 elements long, sumLength has 10. If they want it to be 5 elements long, sumLength is 5. So that's the first thing that would happen, is calling the array constructor. And obviously that creates an array, right? That creates this is JavaScript, so that creates an object of type array. And because we want to use it later, we want to store it in a variable. So on the left-hand side of an equal sign, we have var empty. So we've created a variable called empty, and we've stored in it an array with sumLength. Now, the array doesn't actually have anything in it. This is actually one of the quirks of JavaScript. But then we're going to iterate over the array. This is kind of maybe a building block built on top of building blocks that might be helpful to recognize in JavaScript. So empty is obviously our variable. So we notice I is less than empty.length, and we're starting with I equal to 0, and on every iteration we're incrementing I. So basically I goes from 0 to empty.length, inclusive on the left end at 0 and non-exclusive on the length end. So we iterate over the array basically. And then we specify an array index and assign the empty string, so that's 2 single quotes with no space in between, the empty string to that array index. And what this has the effect of doing is for every location in the array, we're assigning empty strings. So at the end of this code, we have an array of empty strings, which is what the question is asking about. Now in this particular question, they're asking if there's a way to do this in one line, and thankfully there is. And in just a minute, we'll actually read the answer and kind of go line by line and show what it does. So another thing that can be helpful to do as you're reading code is to either add comments, or if you're feeling really adventurous, you can make the code more modular. There's actually a technique called refactoring for understanding. This is a technique that I recommend mostly if you have good unit testing around the code. So it can be very useful if you don't have unit testing, if you can write unit tests for that piece of code and then refactor for understanding and make sure that those tests continue to pass. Because as soon as you start changing code, you have the potential to introduce bugs, especially if you don't know what the code does to begin with. So something to watch out for there. So how can you get better at reading code? First, obviously write more code. The best way to get better at reading code is to write more code. The best way to get better at writing code is to read more code. It's a reinforcing circle, a symbiotic. Definitely do both of them. Spend more time reading code, spend more time writing code, and you will definitely get better at both of them. And of course, to get better at reading code, you should also read more code. So read more code, write more code. That's the best way to get better at both of those things. You should also make your code more readable. Focus on making your code more readable. So add comments, add white space, separate related pieces of your code either into their own functions, or if it makes sense to keep them in a single function, leave white space in between so that related pieces of code, related statements, have no white space between them. Less related chunks of code, maybe you operate on one variable and do a bunch of things, and then you have another section of code that operates on a different variable and either does the same things or does different things. It makes sense to separate them with some white space so that your brain doesn't kind of get muddled by seeing just a stack of lines, line after line after line after line. That's a good way for it to all turn into noise, and it's no longer readable. It's hard for you to read when you come back to it. It's hard for other people to read. It's just bad news all around. Now, with that, hopefully that was helpful. But with that, let's read this Stack Overflow answer. First, let's talk about the update. On newer browsers, you can just do fill, so you can do array 1000 or new array 1000. And notice this answer, they didn't necessarily make the same assumptions as the answerer, or as the question asker. So the question asker said, I want to create a new array of some length, and assume that there's a variable called some length. The person who answered didn't say, let's assume there's a variable called some length. They actually assumed a length. So this 1000, you notice that this string of text is very similar to this, but the main difference is that the length passed into the array constructor was a variable in the question, but is an actual number in the answer. So that subtle differences to watch out for. But if you're familiar with JavaScript, even moderately so, if you've used array before, you might know that in order to create a new array with a specific size, you pass in a number. And if you don't, you can jump over to MDN. We'll actually do that in just a minute on the second answer Stack Overflow answer that I have prepared. And then you can call .fill on that and specify the value you want to fill the array with. So at the end of this line of code, as the comment says, you'll have an array of 1000 empty strings. Now, before this fill method was available, there were other ways to do it. Obviously, this is very similar to the way the original question asker wanted to do it, except instead of creating a new array with a specific size and then iterating over those elements and setting the individual value. This is calling array.push. So from 0 to the number of elements that we want, let's push the initial value. In this case, we'd call it with empty string. So we'd call this function repeat. We'd pass in, to be consistent with this example, we pass in 1,000 as num, and we pass empty string as what2. And that would accomplish that. And we could step through this, right? First, we create an array, an empty array. That's square brackets is creating an empty array in JavaScript. And we assign it to a variable called R, because apparently we're pirates. And then our standard for loop incantation for var I equals 0, I less than num, which is the number of elements to create, I plus plus, right? Very standard stuff. Start from 0, increment at the end of every iteration, and iterate as long as I is less than num. And what do we do inside the for loop? What do we do on every iteration? We call push, the push method on our array, which adds an element to the end of the array. And we the value that we push onto the array is the value of what2. In this case, if we wanted to call this with empty string, we'd pass that as the second argument, and then what2 would be added, would be pushed onto the array num times, let's say 1,000. And then once the for loop is done, what we do is we return the array. So JavaScript doesn't show a return type, but the return type would be array. So we can see our inputs and outputs as num and what2 as inputs, and then this array gets returned. That's our output. Now, there is a slightly easier way to do this, which is, or maybe a more concise way, maybe not easier, but definitely more concise way, which is shown by this example. So in this example, it's actually nice because they explicitly listed out their assumptions. So let's say the number of elements we want is 1,000, is basically what this line is saying. And I could even, if this were code that I could update and write in, I could add a comment at the end of this first line here that said, let's assume the number of elements that we want is 1,000. And leave that comment in there, either for me while I'm continuing to understand things, or maybe this is an example piece of code that we want to be more readable for other people in the future, and adding that comment would really help people out. So then the next piece of code, it actually makes sense to kind of split it up into chunks based on these dots here, right? If it were just a bunch of properties, that something dot something dot something, it makes sense to just say, okay, so we're going down an object, or we're drilling down in an object, and this is the value we want at the end. But each of these is methods. Each of these is a function that's being called. So we really want to think about what each function is doing. And this is actually, this definitely falls into the clever category. So if you look at this, it doesn't make any sense to you, or it's like, I would never have thought of that. That's okay. I didn't think of this either. So we created a new array with 1,000 elements, and basically what they're doing is joining it with the dot sign. So that basically means in JavaScript, well, in most programming languages, the join operator, or the join function, takes the first element and puts whatever join sequence we're using, in this case dot. So the first element, which is empty, and then dot, and then the second element, which is empty, and then dot. So we end up with not 1,000 dots. We actually end up with 999 dots, because we have a dot between all of the elements. And we don't have a dot at the beginning or end of this sequence of elements. So between every pair of elements, we have a dot. So we end up with 999 of them. And then we split on the dot, which, since we have 999 of them, we split at the first dot, we have something on the left, which is actually empty string. We have something on the right, which is empty string, because the next character is a dot. So between every dot, there's an empty string, and there's an empty string at the beginning and end of the line. That ends up with 1,000 empty strings, accomplishing our goal. And if the math doesn't work out, or if you're confused on the math and how that works out, trust me for now. Trust me, that does work. This is valid. I mean, it's Stack Overflow, and this is a fairly well upvoted question. There are actually a few comments below this. The original answer didn't have it right, but then they updated it, and now it is right. And you can prove this out to yourself, either by using JavaScript, or if you want to write it out on a piece of paper, use n equals 5 or something like that, and you could prove it out to yourself. So with that, this video is already getting kind of long, so if that's all you need, go ahead and give this a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But I will go into another example that's a little bit more advanced and has some good examples of things to look at when you're reading code. So this particular problem is we want to treat a string in JavaScript as if it's HTML and get some pieces out of it. Basically, use some of the JavaScript functions, like I think they're trying to do get elements by tag name, which on a string, it is not an HTML tree. It's not a DOM, so you can't do that directly. So I'm actually going to skip over the question because there's actually a lot more words than code, and jump down to the answer here. So the first thing that they point out is strings don't have get elements by tag name. So you can't do exactly the code that you were doing in the question. I'm sure the original poster is totally fine with that. They know that. They just used that, the non-working code where they tried to call get elements by tag name on a string as an example of, like, this is what I'm trying to do. I know this isn't going to work, but I'm using this to communicate, what I'm ultimately trying to do. And one thing that I don't particularly like about this answer is that it's all jammed together. And I'm sure they did that just because of the space constraints on Stack Overflow. But I really would recommend, if you were doing this on your own, put an extra line break between these pieces so that you can see the comments, so that they have some room to breathe, so that it's a little bit easier to understand. But let's go through this answer line by line, because this answer actually doesn't have any inputs. It doesn't really have any outputs. The only output it has is this console.log statement. And the assumptions that it makes are, that's the assumption. It's basically, we're starting with this string, which actually they did pull from the original question. So that first line is pretty much character for character, that line there. I think they just changed, oh no, they're using the exact same types of quotes. So double quotes wrapping the string, single quotes wrapping, we look at this and we see HTML attributes and their values, but obviously JavaScript doesn't care, it's just a string. So var a is this string. The next thing that we do is we create another variable and we assign the value document.createElement div to it. And this comment kind of describes what we're doing. We're creating an element to use to parse it. We're going to create an element so that we can insert this kind of into a virtual DOM. We're not really going to care about adding it to the actual visual DOM, but we just need some HTML element that JavaScript can work with so that we can dump this string into that element and then use it as if it's its own little DOM world. And all the magic happens with inner HTML. So parse it. So inner HTML, right? So here we assign this string that we've created to the inner HTML. And basically what that is instructing the browser to do is take this string, treat it as HTML. It's different from text content, which would just be, treat it as text, don't interpret it as HTML. This says, okay, this is some HTML. Create elements where you need to, populate their attributes, populate their content, their children, whatever, as you need to in order to build up this DOM tree. And then you can use the div to call things like query selector all, or get elements by tag name, I think would work here as well. Query selector all is a newer technique that actually works a lot more similar to how you might be used to if you use jQuery a lot. And basically that's what this person is trying to do. They're trying to do jQuery type things on a string. So instead of on the DOM that's visible in the browser, they want to do it on a string that they have in memory for some reason. Doesn't matter why. This is what they're trying to do. And then there's some magic with array.from and some other stuff. Ultimately, when I was using this, I didn't really care about this part because I just cared about a very specific, I wasn't looking for all divs. I was looking for a very specific div with a very specific content. So I could just use query selector for the one that I was looking for on this div, and I was done. So this, you could treat this whole thing as output, and maybe this is relevant or not. But there is a comment here that is kind of helpful. Find all divs in the results and show their inner HTML. Okay, that's cool. Basically what they're doing is iterating over the results of query selector all. So we're finding all divs inside this div. We're creating an array from this. And actually, array.from is not something I'd ever encountered before. So when you encounter something like this, it's just like encountering a word that you've never seen before in a book you're reading. You go look at the dictionary. In this case, I'd go look at MDN, which is kind of the de facto documentation for all JavaScript stuff. So here's array.from. And sorry, I can't make this bigger because MDN apparently doesn't really like zooming in on their webpage. But this kind of describes what you're doing, and it also provides some nuances. So in JavaScript, and actually in most languages, a string is an iterable thing. It's kind of internally treated as an array of characters. So it does kind of behave like an array in some places. So if you did array.from on a string, they're showing you that you would get an array of FOO. And then here they're also showing you that there's a more advanced way of using array.from where you can pass in an array to array.from, and you can pass a function which manipulates the data in some way and gives you back, in this case, it would be array of 2, 4, 6. So that's pretty cool. This is something that I've never seen before, and now that I know it exists, I've added it to my arsenal, and I might use it in the future. So that's, just from reading this answer, trying to get understanding on something that I was trying to do, I learned something totally unrelated that I might use in the future. So I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so anyway, array.from gives you an array back. So that's what we got from that documentation. So we get an array back, and then we can do for each, and this behaves kind of like a for loop, unsurprisingly. And of course, we've got the MDN documentation for it here, and they show a pretty simple example. So you've got an array containing A, B, and C, and then you can do array1.forEach and do this function for each element. Just log it out, right? So we get the output is A, B, and C. Okay, so for each, we call this function. The input is a div, and that we know that this is just a variable. So they're calling it div because that we know, semantically, that's what we're getting back from this selector query. But realistically, that's just a name we need to give for the for each variable so that we can use it inside the body. And then we can print out the inner HTML. So in this case, they have two divs here. So we'll get first div class equals render1, second, and then the next log statement will just print out second because that's the second div that we found. And that's its inner HTML. Even though it's just text, it'll still print out even though there's no HTML there. And then, of course, they add the note. Naturally, you can do more advanced processing with the for each callback if you want to extract other information. Okay, that's helpful. That's pretty cool. But this example actually does a pretty good job of demonstrating how you would do it. But notice that there's some extraneous code, right? This was good because it's the assumption that they're making, but really the magic is here. Create an element to use to parse it, and then parse it, or get the browser to parse it, convince the browser to parse it. This is just what you're doing with the div after the fact, kind of to complete the original poster's question, I think. Yeah, well, kind of to show how they're getting render and render one, the text that is inside render and render one. So I needed to do something a little bit simpler than that, but this answer helped me, and really I just needed those 2 lines, those 2 actual code lines. So these are 2 examples that I legitimately used within the last week or so, and I went through reading those examples exactly the way I just described. Obviously, I've been doing this for quite a while, so it didn't take me 15 minutes to do it. I looked at it, I kind of mentally went through these answers, and I was able to get what I needed out of them relatively quickly. But that just comes from experience. That comes from reading Stack Overflow answers, doing this, writing code, trying things out, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, and just continuing to do it. So with that, I want to invite you to like this video, share it with anyone you think might need a leg up on being able to read code, because it really is a fantastic skill to have. It's definitely I think it's a necessary skill to have. Many other people think it's a necessary skill to have, and you're probably watching this video because you think it's a necessary skill to have. So definitely I want to support that. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Hopefully this video helped you understand how to read code and why it's important to read code. And I also want to encourage you, if you feel like you're stuck, if you feel like you're at a point in your career where you keep running up against a wall, you're writing code, but you feel like every time you hit a roadblock, you don't know what to do. I want to encourage you to continue reading code and continue writing code, and just take it slow. There's nothing wrong with going at the pace that's right for you. If it takes you longer to read the code and to understand the code, take it. Absolutely. You will get faster with time. You will get better with time. That's a given. If this is something you're really passionate about and you think is really important, I encourage you to stick with it. Absolutely. Just you will get there. I promise you. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see the amazing things you do with code. Thanks.